Everybody got quiet. It must be time to start. Open up your Bibles, if you would, to Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3, and we are going to talk about the justification by faith this evening. Before we get into chapter 3, we're going to back up just a little bit and talk a little bit about what we ended out the other night with in chapter 2. In chapter 2, starting in about verse 25, really, he's been talking about, of course, in chapter 2, about the fact that the Jews were also those who had sinned. In Romans chapter 1, it was the Gentiles that sinned. They have done all of those things. And then he turns around in chapter 2 and says, "But you, old man, are guilty of doing the very same things that they have done." And then at the end of chapter 2 here, and of course when Paul wrote this, remember he didn't have chapters and verses that he broke it into. We did that much later. So don't let that break your train of thought going on through there. But then in chapter 2 he's talking about this idea of circumcision. And one of the things, of course, as Jews, they're thinking, but we are circumcised and we are of Abraham's seed and we are the ones that has this special relationship with God, as if those were the things that would save them. And what Paul does, we talked about at the end of class last week, what he does here at the end of chapter 2 is he redefines what it means to be a Jew. And later on in Romans, he's going to come back to this and spend quite a bit more time on it, but he's just kind of introducing the idea right now of redefining what it means to be a Jew. It's not one who has been circumcised physically, he says, that's a Jew, but it's one who has been circumcised internally, the cutting away of the problems of the heart that really is what makes someone a Jew indeed, one who is really going to be praised by God. And so after redefining what it means to be a Jew, then in chapter 3, he's still talking to the Jews here, but the first question that he asks in verse 1 is then, what advantage has the Jew? Now, a couple of things that before we get into really the text here that is important for us to think about. That then, or maybe if you're looking at a different translation, the ESV, it'll say therefore or something of that nature, but it's connecting us back to what he's been talking about with in chapter 2. But particularly, if you will go back and look at verse 12 of chapter 2 and notice what he says here. What advantage is there to being a Jew? Well, back in verse 12, he says, "For all who have sinned without the law," and who is that? The Gentiles. "All who have sinned without the law will perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law," and who is that? The Jews. "All who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law, for it's not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who are justified." So what he's painting, I've been telling you all along, we had to go through a bunch of bad news, and we're still looking at bad news, but he's painting us into a corner that no matter where we came from, to realize that we can't justify or make ourselves righteous on our own. We have to have Jesus. Because everybody has a law. For the Jew, if you happen to be born in the lineage of Abraham, you had the law of Moses. Now, the problem with the law of Moses is how many people had ever kept it 100%? One. Jesus was the only one. None of them had. And we're thankful Jesus did, but no one else did. But understand, the problem wasn't with the law. The problem was with us, see. Turn over to Romans chapter 7. And somebody, when you get to Romans chapter 7, read real loud and read verses like 12, 13, and 14. Romans 7, 12, 13, 14.
Certainly not. But sin, in spite of pure sin,
See, what the problem was, and what he's saying there, maybe Romans 7:12 through 14 says it better. The problem wasn't with the law. And I don't know, maybe sometimes we've been too harsh in the way we've talked about it, or maybe I just didn't pay good enough attention to my teachers whenever I was in Bible school classes when I was younger. But the impression that I always had was that the old law was bad, that it was flawed. But Paul tells us it's not the law that was problematic. The law was perfect because it came from a God who is perfect. So if the law wasn't the problem, then that can only leave one thing. What's the one thing that could be the problem? Me. Yeah, the people. It's us. See? And so when we broke the law, the Jews broke the law of Moses, then we had sin, and sin separated us from God, don't you see? Now, that's for those who were Jewish. For everybody else, the Gentiles, they had a law that he's going to describe as the law of conscience. So their conscience told them some things that were wrong and were right. And every one of those people, what had they done with that law? They had broke it. So they had sinned, right? And so what Paul is setting up here is an understanding of the fact that if you're counting on law to make you righteous or to justify you, the only way that it can do it is if you keep it perfectly, see? And so because of that, whenever you stand before God in judgment, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, if you've been counting on law, not Jesus, but law, that's who he's talking about in Romans 2 and 3. He's talking about people that aren't trusting in Jesus for salvation. These are people that I've kept the law, I've done the law, I've been a good person, I've been good enough, that kind of idea. If I'm counting on law at the day of judgment, what am I going to get? Yeah, condemnation, Eddie said, or from the text of 2, what he calls it is the wrath of God. See? Because if I'm standing before God trusting in law, I haven't kept the law perfectly. Even if we talked about, I don't remember if it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, we gave the illustration. Even if I'd lived my whole life and I'd kept every law, never gone 1 mile over the speed limit, I'd done everything that I should have, and I only killed one person. What am I? I'm a murderer. I'm guilty, right? I've never done anything wrong. I was always a good boy, except that one time I stole $50,000 from the bank. But only one time, and it was just $50,000. What am I? I'm a thief. I'm guilty. See? So that's what law does for us, see? So the problem is not the law, the problem is sin. Now, what do we do about sin? That's what he's really getting to. So when you get to chapter 3 and verse 1, the Jews are listening to all that and they're saying, well, if what you're saying is true, Paul, then what advantage has there been to being a Jew? And there must have been some advantage, because twice in chapter 1 and verse 16 and in chapter 2 verses 9 and 10, he had talked about to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So what advantage is there? Why was it that something was brought to us first if there's no advantage to being a Jew? Now, to kind of jump ahead a little bit, if you'll drop on down, he says, or what is the value of circumcision, which is kind of saying the same thing. But if you jump on down to verse 9, notice what he says here in verse 9. What then? Are we Jews any better off? Now there he's going to say, no, not at all. But he's going to give a little bit of a different answer in the first part of this chapter. And then if you scroll way on down here to chapter 4 and verse 1, what then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather? See, that's the question that would would be asked. And then in the middle of all that, chapter 3 and verse 27, what then becomes of our boasting? See, the Jews had this mindset that we were better than the Gentiles because we had the law, see. And it's just like we talked about last week with our life. Sometimes we can be guilty of thinking, well, we've got truth, right? And we do. We've got truth right here. The problem is that law keeping is not going to save us. And again, maybe I just didn't pay good attention, but I always kind of had the impression growing up that, we went from the law of Moses and then Jesus came, and then we went from that set of law, we went to another law that we're under. But that's not what he teaches here, see. Now, we'll come back to that a little bit later, and if I forget, Eddie, throw something at me and remind me. But because when we say things like that, what we naturally want to run to is, well, of course, then we don't have to obey. But I didn't say that. We've been very clear all along, or I've tried to be. There's a difference in salvation by works and obedience. Are you with me? So what justifies us or makes us righteous? Well, it's not law. So go back up to chapter 3 and verse 1. He says, what advantage has the Jew, or what is the value of circumcision? He says, much in every way. Now, again, Paul's going to expound on this a little bit when we get over to chapter 9. But the point that he's making, like when he gets down to verse 9 and he says none at all, he means that the Jew doesn't have any advantage in judgment. Okay? But is there something that is special about what the Jews, to the Jew first and also to the Greek? Well, yeah. You had the law. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. Does somebody have a translation that has something different than oracles? No, sometimes it'll be revelation or testimonies or something like that. The word, though, that's translated oracles here is a word that was really special in ancient Greek. They would use it to talk about language that came from the gods, their gods, as they would say, a revelation that came from the gods to man. So when they would talk about one of the Greek gods giving a message to a person, it was an oracle, see? And so he's not just talking about you got anything, you got an oracle, you got a revelation from God. You had the law, and that was something that was really awesome. Back up in chapter 2 verse 13, he talked a little bit about this idea, though, that it wasn't just having the law that mattered, you had to obey the law. See, but it was an advantage you were entrusted with these oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written. So their response to that is, if we had the law and we were enlightened by these oracles of God, and we didn't believe in Jesus, we didn't put our trust in Jesus, so it must be that Jesus wasn't really the Messiah, right? If we all agree that Jesus wasn't the Messiah, then He couldn't have been the Messiah, right? So what if we all agree that orange is black? Does that make orange black? No. The majority agreeing on something doesn't make it what's right. And that's his point. Now, that was one of the arguments that even in the time when Jesus was still here on the earth living, you remember that was one of the things that the Pharisees tried to say is, we talked about in John several times about the Pharisees claiming that, well, none of the Pharisees believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Was that true? Who are some Pharisees in John that we saw that believed in Jesus? You remember? Remember the guy that came to Him by night? Who was that? Nicodemus. Nicodemus was a Pharisee. And then there's another couple of times it talked about, not specifically, but generically some Pharisees. Paul, who's writing this letter, was a was a Jew. He was a Pharisee. So it's not true. First of all, it's not a true statement to say that none of us believed, because some did believe, right? But even if everybody didn't believe in Jesus, would that change who Jesus is? No. So that's why he says, let every man be a liar. Because if God says it's A, and we all say it's B, guess what it is? It's A, 100% of the time. Every time. See? Doesn't matter what we say or think. So our faithlessness, and notice that contrast there, their faithlessness and the faithfulness of God, let God be true though everyone were a liar, as it is written. Now you're going to notice that he's going to use this kind of terminology. He already has a couple of times, and he's going to several more times as we keep going through here. He'll say, as it is written, and point back to some Old Testament scriptures. And of course, one of the things that we tried to point out when we looked at the second half of chapter 1 is when he's talking about the Gentiles, he didn't talk about Old Testament scriptures because that's not what they were following, right? But the Jews are jumping up and down and saying, hey, we have the law, and the law makes us righteous. And he said, you know that's not right. Because look at the law that you have, and what does it say? So he tells them, Psalm 50 and verse 6, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. How are we going to be justified in our words? See, that's not just what we say is not going to God's going to be right with what He says. What He says is what matters, not what we say. He says in verse 5, but if our unrighteousness serves to show the unrighteousness of God, then what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? So if we are unrighteous, we are not made righteous by keeping of the law or by possessing the law, and we're not, then how could we say that God is not being righteous by giving us wrath? Go back up to chapter 2 and verse 5, and that's where he talks about that. If I have broken the law, if I've not kept the law, and I'm punished, is God being righteous? Is that righteous to punish me? Yeah. God's always righteous. If I've broken the law, then it's righteous to punish me. Right? I mean, that's as simple as it is. Let me ask it a different way. If somebody else broke the law, is it righteous to punish them? Absolutely, right? But when it comes to me, is it righteous to punish me if I've... Well, it still is righteous to punish me if I've been unrighteous. And that's what he's saying. God is not unrighteous to give us wrath. He says, I speak in a human way. By no means. Look back up here in chapter 3, verse 4. Notice this, by no means. He's going to use that phrase, and it's sometimes translated a few different ways, but he's going to use that phrase. I don't know if you can see all of my chicken scratching there. Several places here in chapter 3, in chapter 6, in chapter 7, in chapter 9. He's going to anticipate what it was that might be their argument and ask this question, is this where we're going to lead our thinking to? And he's going to say, by no means, or shall it never be, or something of that effect, depending on your translation. But he's setting up their arguments for them, and then he's knocking them down. And it's not straw man arguments that he's setting up either, because these are not only the things that he himself had thought and taught, but that undoubtedly he'd heard Jews give back to him over and over again. So by no means can we say that God is unrighteous for giving us wrath when we've broken law. For then how could God judge the world? If God was unrighteous, how could He be the judge? Could He be? No. And we understand that even in our, the best we can do with the judicial system, if we find out a judge is dishonest, he's taking bribes, or he's got connections to the mob, or I don't know if that really happens, but it was on a lot of movies I'd watch when I was a kid, but something like that, do we let him stay as a judge? No, because we need a judge that's going to render correct, just, fair decisions, right? God can be judged because He's righteous. So what you're saying, in essence, is that, listen, we know that we hadn't done everything exactly right, but we are God's people. We've had the law. We've had circumcision. We're descendants from Abraham. So you're saying God shouldn't punish you? Well, if God doesn't punish you, then He's no longer righteous. And if God's not righteous, then He can't be judged. Are you with me? Does that make sense? He's trying to help them understand that law's not going to cut it. He said, but if through my lie God's truth abounds to His glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? So in other words, he's trying to think through it the way that they're saying it. If what you're saying is true, if my lie, the lie that he talked about earlier is this idea that I'm righteous and God is not righteous. I said it and we all believe it, so God must be lying about it. Abounds to His glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? See, what I'm doing is I'm showing by my life how unrighteous I am and how righteous that He is. So if that's the case, and if it's a good thing that my unrighteousness shows how righteous God is and it causes Him to be glorified, then isn't that a good thing? It's kind of similar to the question He's going to ask at the beginning of chapter 6 when He talks about grace. He's going to say, they're going to think, well, grace is a good thing. So if the more we sin, the more grace we get, then we ought to sin a bunch more to get more grace. And He'll say, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? May it never be. God forbid. See? That's bless you. That's backwards way of thinking. See? So by my unrighteousness, I'm showing God's righteousness, so I ought to be unrighteous, right? Well, no. That's backwards thinking, see? And why not do evil that good may come, as some people slanderously charge us with saying their condemnation is just. Okay, so these Jews are thinking that, listen, we get that we're not perfect, but we're better than them, right? Than they are. There's that they and us, they and you from Paul's perspective. Do we ever have that mentality? I know I'm not perfect, but listen, what I'm doing is not as bad as that Kirk Moore, I'll tell you. Do you know what all? Let me tell you what all he's been involved in. Do you mind leaving the room for a minute? We'll just talk about it. Say, what he's doing has to be worse than what I'm doing, right? Meanwhile, what's Kirk telling Jeff over there? I know I'm not perfect, but that Corey, you know, you come up to, if you got something from me by email or Facebook or something that don't look like me, it's not me, okay? He said, did you send me an email? I said, no. And he said, I didn't think that was you. It looked like really bad stuff. And I said, no, I haven't been sending you bad stuff, you know. But we can look at other people and say, well, I can't believe Corey would send me that. Can you believe that? What they do is always worse than what I do. But whatever it is, we're still in the same boat. Jew or Gentile, see? So verse 9, what then? Are we Jews any better off? We've got the law, but we haven't been keeping the law. So are we really any better off in judgment? No. No, not at all. For we've already charged that both Jews and Greeks are under sin. He charged that the Greeks were under sin in chapter 1. He charged that the Jews were under sin in chapter 2. So that means if the Jews are guilty of sin, law breaking, if the Gentiles are guilty of sin and law breaking, that means that everybody, because from their perspective, That's the only categories there were. There was Jew or Greek. So if there's only two categories and both categories are guilty of sin, guess what that means? Everybody's guilty of sin. As it is written. So now he's going to do again. You had the law. This shouldn't be breaking news to you because you had the law as it is written, and he's going to start off Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 is what this first few verses here. Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are almost identical psalms to each other. There's a little bit of difference in the title. There's a little bit of difference at the end of those psalms. There's a difference in the names of God that are being used, and there's a purpose for that. But that's not the purpose of our class. Maybe some other time we'll talk about that. But he's quoting from Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 because they're basically the same psalm. But notice these words that he's used. I've tried to circle them in blue up there. None is righteous. So if none is righteous, who is righteous? Nobody. That none is a pretty all-inclusive word, isn't it? None is righteous. No, just in case you missed that, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. Here's another all-inclusive word. All have turned aside. So if all have turned aside, who has not turned aside? Nobody left, right? Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Then in verse 13, he's going to quote Psalm 5 and verse 9. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Then he's going to quote from Psalm 10 and verse 7. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Then he's going to quote from Isaiah 59 verses 7 and 8. Their feet are swift to shed blood, in their paths they ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. And then he's going to quote Psalm 36 in verse 1, there is no fear of God before their eyes. See, this law that we have has told us not that the Gentiles are evil, but who's evil? All are. In all of that old law, he didn't tell us that the Gentiles were not righteous. Who did he say was not righteous? No one. None. Jew and Gentile. That's not just something that I came up with and started preaching, Paul says. That's what you've known all along. That's why in that promise, 1,800 years before Jesus set foot on the earth as Jesus, 1,800 years before that, God's talking to Abraham and He says, through thee and thy seed, who's going to be blessed? The Jews? What does He say? All nations will be blessed. Why? Because all nations need Jesus. See? That system of justification is what he's talking about. So, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. Here's the point, is that if you are under law, when you stand before God, that's what He's going to judge you by. Which law? Well, if you're over there in Israel being raised the seed of Abraham, it's the law of Moses. If you're up in the Congo, or you're in South America in the jungle, or you're somewhere in Canada up in the frozen tundra, wherever, and you're just living life, then you've got that law of conscience. And you're going to stand before God with law as your system of justification, and you're going to say, I'm righteous. And He's going to say, Jew, did you ever break one of the laws? 613 of them. Did you break any of them? Well, yeah. Then what are you? Guilty. I wish I'd have borrowed one of y'all's gavels. That would have been a good one. Guilty. See? And then one of the Gentiles steps up and he says, well, I wasn't under the law of Moses. Yeah, but you were under the law of conscience. Well, yeah. Did you ever break your conscience? Well, yeah. Guilty. And the Jews saying, but we're better than them. You're both guilty. Right? So, for by works of the law. Now, see what I did right here? See that X there? Because "the" is not really there. He's not just talking about the law of Moses here. And by the way, we can't always go by whether the "thee" is there or not. Sometimes we put more on that than what Scripture does. But he's not saying the law of Moses. He's saying law. So, you say I got a star beside this verse 20. This is where Paul's been heading this whole time. Because by works of law. Which law? Well, are you a Jew? We're talking about the law of Moses. Are you a Gentile? We're talking about the law of conscience. By works of law, whichever law you might have been living under, no human being. Remember him quoting all those scriptures and saying, none is righteous, no, not one. All have fallen away, turned away. So because none are righteous, no, not one, because we've all turned away, then law, whatever law it is that you're under, is not going to be what justifies us or makes us righteous in God's sight. Since through law, any law, comes knowledge of sin. So if law is not going to save us, and it's not that there's something wrong with law, the problem is us, but if that's the case, then what's the purpose of law? Well, there's probably maybe some others that we could talk about, but here's a few of the purposes of law that he tells us about in Romans and over in Galatians as well. And we've been talking about in our Wednesday night class in Romans and our Sunday morning classes in Galatians about how similar the message of both of those are. But first of all, the law tells us what sin is. It tells us these are the things that you should avoid. These are the things that you should not be doing. Okay? It also points me in the right direction. It tells me these are the things that you ought to be seeking after. The things that you ought to be doing. See? But then, and this is really more from Galatians 3 than it is from Romans, but he's going to really strongly hint at this in Romans, if not come right out and say it. But in Galatians 3, 24 and 25, he tells us that the law was our tutor. Now, you know what a tutor is, right? How many of y'all were a tutor? How many of y'all needed a tutor? A lot more hands on the second question, but tutor somebody that helps, instructs you, and gets you to where you need to be. See, the law was our tutor to bring us to Jesus. The law is supposed to not be something that we latch onto and say, that's what's going to save me, but the law is supposed to be that helps us to understand that we need Jesus. So, if I stand before God and I say, I'm under the law of Moses, am I going to be righteous? No, I am, what's the word? Guilty. If I stand and say I'm a Gentile, I'm under the law of conscience, am I righteous? No, I am guilty. Now we talk about this being really complicated, and Romans is, but I'm trying to make this as simple as I can, okay? But if I stand before Him in Jesus, then how am I judged? By law? How am I judged? How am I judged, Eddie? By love, by grace. All right, so where do we want to be when we stand before God? Under law or under grace? Now, we don't like to talk about grace. Kind of scares us. And the reason why, well, you're saying I don't have to do anything. That's not what I'm saying at all. And it's not what Paul's saying. He's going to talk a lot about obedience. He hasn't even told us how to get in Jesus yet. He's going to do that later on. But he's also going to talk about the fact that we're not just going to do whatever we want to do. Who does God give His grace to? Those that are seeking to follow Him. See? So, I know I'm very simplistic. My mind is, I'm not real smart, and so I try to make it simple for me to understand. And maybe if this don't make any sense to you, then Eddie can explain it better on Sunday morning for you. But if you think about that blue line up there being perfection, how many of us are going to get to that blue line? None. But that's what we act like, isn't it? I hope I'm good enough. Hope I've done enough. Well, the blue line's what you have to do enough of to get to. And we're not going to get there. Okay? But what is your trajectory? Now, that's not really a biblical term, but it's a biblical principle, I believe. So it doesn't matter where I start. Notice the orange line up there started really high, close to the line, but it really tails off. See? The pink line, it starts out pretty good and then it tails off. This is kind of like the Jesus telling the parable of the sower and seed, you know. You got the blue line, the darker blue line or purplish looking line, that see all those dips? How many of y'all's walk with Jesus looks like that line? I'm going to tell you right now, that's mine. I would like it to be more like that light blue line where, you know, it's pretty steady. Every now and again there's a dip, but it's pretty steady heading upward. Okay? But my line probably looks more like that purplish line in there. There's a whole, but overall, where's the trajectory heading? Up. See? God knows if that's my trajectory. If I'm making mistakes and I'm doing things that I shouldn't, but I'm trying not to. See, that's like 1 John chapter 1. If you walk in the light as He's in the light, His blood cleanses us from all unrighteousness. See, we're going to sin. He tells us there in 1 John chapter 1. But what's my trajectory? Am I trying to obey Him? See, does that make sense? That's what He wants us to do. But we got to understand two things that He's trying to really hammer in Romans. Number one, we've got to what's a good word for this? We've got to acknowledge our sins. Acknowledge the fact that we sin, that none of us are perfect. The Jews are saying, look at us. None of us are perfect. We've got to acknowledge that. But at the same time, we've got to acknowledge that we don't have to be perfect to be saved. That's what He wants us to get to. And we don't have as much problem admitting the first. We have a harder problem, in my experience, admitting the second. That God is going to save us. And the reason is because I know what my line looks like and how many dip downs there were. And I'm ashamed of them and disappointed in them, and I can only assume that God is too. But God knows what my trajectory is. Are you with me? Does that make sense? Eddie, did you have a comment? That's right. Yeah. So if you heard Eddie, that's what he's talking about. When we get to Romans 7, Paul's going to use himself as an example of that. He's going to say, the things that I want to do, I don't do. The things that I don't want to do, I end up doing. But what was Paul's trajectory? He's growing closer to Jesus. He called himself the chief of sinners, but he also realized that he wasn't saved by how close to law he lived, see? And that's the point that Paul's trying to get to here, that we've got to understand where he's been going with all of this, is that we're not going to be justified by law. Now, we still haven't really got to that good news yet. We're going to get there, I promise you. You stick with me. But the point that he's trying to back us into a corner and say, you mean to tell me, Paul, it doesn't matter how good I live, I can't earn my salvation? No. And we're afraid to say that because we think that somebody's going to say, well, they're going to think they can do whatever they want to and be saved. Not if they understand grace. See? So what he's really focusing on is what is your means of justification? What means of salvation are you focused on? Are you thinking you're going to be saved by your works? Or are you saved by Jesus? Are you going to be saved by your law keeping? Or are you saved by His grace? And if I realize, if you go all the way back to chapter 1, we first started talking about this. Remember us talking about how Paul said he was a slave to God? If I am a slave and my master is benevolent and loving and kind, guess what I'm going to want to do? I'm going to want to do anything He asks me to. We're going to obey. Our trajectory is going to head up. But understand, He's not waiting for us to dip down to say, He's gone, He's out, I'm done with Him. I knew He wouldn't make it. That's not what He wants, see. But because of grace, and Jesus taking that punishment for us, what He's going to get to, that allows God to be just, to be righteous Himself, and to be justifier, or the one who makes us righteous. See? All right, so we're still backing ourselves into a corner and still dealing with bad news, but we'll get to the good news eventually, okay? All right, any questions or comments? I know this is meat of the word stuff, and it's tough. I'm trying to make it as simple as I can. Part of what makes it hard, though, isn't what he says. It's comparing what he says to what we've always wanted to believe and think and the way we've worded things. And we got to be honest that a lot of times what we've done is we've worded things to make easy arguments to win a debate. But Paul's not worried about winning a debate here. He's trying to tell us how we're saved. And that's what we ought to be worried about as well. Okay? So, if you'll read the rest of chapter 3, we'll pick up with verse 21 next week and continue this idea of justification by faith. As we get turned off online, those of you that are online watching, we hope that you're able to be with us in person soon. Those of you that are here, we have a few announcements that we want to make before we are dismissed. A few updates on our